Welcome to the Cardboard Crash Course. My name's Ethan. Let's learn how to play Arkham Horror, the card game. Arkham Horror, the card game is a cooperative LCG in which 1 to 4 investigators work together to investigate hidden mysteries and thwart wicked conspiracies within the Cthulhu mythos. Each game will add to a broader narrative story called a campaign, where they gain experience and allow them to grow and add more powerful cards to their deck while attempting to survive. I'm going to teach you how to set up and play your very first game of Arkham Horror the card game, using the 2026 core set, which is a great way for new players to get into the game. I mean this video to be directed at new players, but if you're a returning player with a different core set, you can still follow along, although the exact visuals will be a little different. Before we talk about how to actually set up the game, let's talk a little bit about this campaign guide and a couple other fundamental concepts in the game. This campaign guide is included with this core set that I'm using, and this Spreading Flame scenario at the beginning is what you're going to play first of 3 scenarios, including Smoke and Mirrors and Queen of Ash below it. I'll teach you how to fully set up and play through your Spreading Flames scenario, because you'll always be playing a single scenario that makes up a campaign when playing Arkham Horror. That being said, you'll be able to take all the information that you learned today to bring it into your Smoke and Mirrors and Queen of Ash games after the fact. Winning and losing conditions are also specified within each scenario in the campaign guide and on the cards themselves. Let's talk a moment about what you may find inside of these scenarios. The scenario itself is split up into 3 decks: the Agenda deck, the Act deck, and the Encounter deck. The Act deck on the right here represents the investigator's progress in achieving their goals, and the further they reach in the Act deck, the more favorable the resolution for the scenario becomes. The Agenda deck on the left, on the other hand, represents the progress made by the dark forces of the mythos. Advancing in the Agenda deck gradually progresses towards a resolution very unfavorable for the investigators. When placed next to each other as I have here, the Act and Agenda decks form the image of an open book, and work together to form the plot of the current scenario. Now the Encounter deck, on the other hand, is much larger and represented by this face-down deck here. This is the perils, monsters, madnesses, and schemes that investigators must overcome. The cards in this deck come in the form of enemy and treachery cards. Throughout the scenario, investigators draw these cards from the deck and overcome them using the tools and talents that their investigator provides them. Also within the scenario are these location cards. They represent all the locales where investigators and enemies might be located during that scenario. They always enter play with their unrevealed side face up. But when an investigator places their mini card on that location, representing that they're currently there for the first time, the card then gets revealed to its revealed side. The revealed side of these locations are largely where investigators will encounter clues, which are helpful in advancing their positive Act deck. I also want to point out on some cards, including this Act card here, there is this per investigator icon. It's shown here next to this number value, and multiplies that number value by the number of investigators who started the scenario. So in the example I'm going to show you once we set up, we'll be setting up for a 2-player game. So in this case, this number would always mean 4 for all reasons during that scenario, including if an investigator has resigned or been defeated. Another important concept in the game is this Chaos Bag. Throughout the game, investigators are asked to randomly reveal tokens from this bag, and if it's during a skill test, will modify the skill test itself by the numerical value that you pull. But if you pull any other icons, like this skull icon here, then you'll refer to the current scenario reference card to determine that token's effect. Skill tests and different effects of the tokens are of course something that I'll talk about in just a bit. I also want to talk for a moment about the investigators that come with this core set. There are 5 of them, and they all have pre-built decks that you'll keep together for your very first game. Investigators also have different values on their cards, as well as different abilities, and of course the decks that came with them that modify all of their different abilities and powers that they can do throughout the game. But for the very first game, if you're playing solo, it's recommended that you start off with Joe Diamond. And if you're playing with 2 players, Joe Diamond and Isabel Barnes are recommended. And as such, for a 2-player game example that I'll be doing in this video, I'll be selecting Joe Diamond and Isabel Barnes to set up. I recommend that you choose the same so you can follow along exactly. But if you want to pick a different investigator for your first game or even for a game in the future, please do so. The investigator deck also has this back to it, and always has a couple of weakness cards included, which are actually negative effect cards, while the rest of the deck is largely positive. I guess Joe Diamond is not a perfect person after all. The most important part of picking out an investigator for your very first game are these 4 symbols found on the top right of the investigator sheet. That's willpower, intellect, combat, and agility, and what come into play when doing different skill tests. When you do a skill test, you'll compare this value to the value that you're given for the test. The higher the investigator's skill value is in that skill, the greater their ability to perform tasks relating to that skill. And the final fundamental concept I want to touch on is the lead investigator token. This will be chosen during setup in just a moment, and it's the player who breaks ties and makes decisions for the group, even if there's a time of conflict. This is a cooperative game, so players should work together fairly equally, but sometimes you just cannot come to a decision and you're running out of time. This game is fairly complex, and it's a card game, which means that rules are printed largely on the cards themselves. So if you run into a rules or timing conflict, the lead investigator can break that conflict if you just cannot find it in the rules reference or the campaign guide. Additionally, anytime in the game that something says to do something in player order, it moves one at a time in clockwise order around the table, starting with this lead investigator. With all of that said, let's learn how to set up our game with the Spreading Flames scenario. To set up your game, start by choosing your investigator. We already talked about how we're going to start with Joe Diamond and Isabel Barnes, but this would be the moment in which you could make a different choice if someone else is speaking to you. Each player removes the reference card from their deck and places their investigator card face up in their play area. They also shuffle their starting deck, which is all of the cards with this back that are included with your investigator, placing it face down in front of you as well. Then you'll choose which player will be the lead investigator for the game, which includes giving them the lead investigator token as well as the campaign guide to follow along with. Additionally, take your investigator's mini card to represent your location during the game. We'll then also set up the common reserve supply of tokens, including damage tokens, horror tokens, double-sided clue/doom tokens, connector tokens, and resource tokens. These pools represent the repository for all of the tokens that are not currently in play. We'll now assemble the chaos bag by placing a number of tokens indicated on our scenario into the bag. Please pause the video now and take a look at the screen. These exact chaos tokens shown to the right of my bag here are placed inside of the bag. Then take all of the other tokens that will be left in a pile and place them back in the game box, as they will not be used for this scenario. Also placed back in the box were all of the unused investigators and the 2 unused scenarios that we're not playing at the moment. You will not need them for this scenario. Each investigator now takes exactly 5 resources from the resource pool of tokens and places them near their investigator card. This is their starting resources for the game. Each investigator now also draws 5 cards from their deck as their starting hand of cards. If any of the cards that are in your starting hand are a weakness card, you can tell they're a weakness card because they say the word weakness in this sub-box. Take that card and place it aside, and then replace that card with a new card into your starting hand from your deck. Then shuffle any of the revealed weakness cards back into the deck, because you won't want to start out with them during this game. After the investigators are fully set up, now it's time to set up for the scenario. You'll first gather all of the scenario cards. That's all of the cards that came in the pack with that scenario, regardless of what scenario symbol is on that card. There's a full list of cards that should be in a scenario in the rulebook, so if you're gaining this secondhand or you've already opened the packs and started to separate things, please refer to the rulebook for what cards should be in there for your first scenario. Each scenario has its own encounter set icon, like this little fire next to the fire treachery here. These icons will come into play when you begin to build decks and build scenarios, but for now, please, please, please keep together all of the cards that were included when you opened up the box. We'll then assemble the agenda deck by stacking the agenda cards from this scenario's encounter set in sequential order, so that we see in the top right-hand corner here that 1A is on top of 2A, which is on top of 3A, and so on if there were more. The act deck works in the exact same way, with 1A on the top, 2A, and so on. Place these next to each other and stacked so that you can't see any of the cards except for the top card. This should be in plain view in the center of the table for all players to very clearly read the cards. Sometimes I find it easier to read for a 2-player game if both players are seated at the same side of the table, which is not normally how I usually play games, but for a cooperative game like this, it feels very comfortable. Then we'll take the reference card for the scenario and place it to the left of our assembled agenda deck. This is 2-sided with the lower difficulty on one side and the higher on the other. You can see this with the easy/standard side being face up here, which I heavily recommend for your first game. Flipping this over is how you adjust the difficulty if you'd like to play a more perilous scenario later once you've learned the rules. Now this is where our campaign guide starts to come into play, because it's time to place locations. Following these setup instructions on page 3 of our campaign guide, we'll put the Your Friend's Room card into play, with the unrevealed side face up. We'll also take all of the other location cards that were included and set them off to the side out of play for now. After putting the locations out, we'll assemble the encounter deck. Following the same page in the scenario setup instructions, we'll find all 5 copies of the Fire Treachery, the Servant of Flame, and Dr. Henry Armitage. Set aside all of those with the locations that we just set aside. Then shuffle the rest of the encounter deck and place it nearby in reach of all players and with enough space for a discard pile. That's all of the cards with this back. Now, this is where the story of the campaign comes more into play than the actual gameplay itself. You'll read off the scenario introduction, which is on the top left of the campaign guide, page 3 here, on Spreading Flames. Then follow it by reading the text on the face-up agenda and act cards to get all players onto the same page. This sets the mood and makes sure that all players are on the same page about the setting and the specific rules about this scenario within our campaign. Our campaign guide also told us that all of the investigators begin the game at Your Friend's Room, so place all of their mini cards on that card. Now, we already talked about how placing an investigator for the first time on a location reveals that location, so that will happen now. The standard rules for revealing a location, either now or during the game, are to place clues on that location card equal to its clue value. The clue value is this symbol to the right here, and is 2 clues per investigator on that location. Because of that, we'll place a total of 4 clues on there to start the game. Finally, place all of the components that were not specifically told to you to use during this scenario back in the box, as they won't be used for this game. Your setup for your game of 2 players should look something like this, with each player being in charge of their investigator, as well as their investigator deck and their starting hand of 5 cards with the 5 resources. The lead investigator also has the lead investigator token and the campaign guide for what we're playing handy. The chaos bag, the extra tokens, and the scenario setup we already went over should be in the central play area for all players to modify and be able to read what's on them. This game would have set up extremely similarly for a 1-player game or a 3 or 4-player game. The only differences would be the number of investigators set up and the number of clue tokens that were placed on Your Friend's Room. Now it's time to learn how to actually play the game. You're now ready to play your game of Arkham Horror the card game. In this game, it's played over a series of rounds. Each round takes place over 4 different phases. The Mythos Phase, the Investigation Phase, the Enemy Phase, and then the Upkeep Phase. I'm going to go over each of these phases now, and they'll be broken up with timestamps that you can find in the description. The Investigation Phase is going to be a very large portion, because in that phase's description, I'm also going to talk about all of the different actions you can do during the investigation phase. If you want to get a briefer overview, check out each of the phases and then come back to the investigation phase to learn about what you can do on your turn. An additional note is that even though there are 4 phases to each round, the very first phase, the Mythos Phase, is skipped on the very first round of the game. So you'll start off the game by going directly into the first investigation phase. But from then on, every one of the rounds is going to be broken up into those 4 phases with none of them skipped. Once a round is complete at the end of the Upkeep Phase, we'll then go into the next round starting with that round's Mythos Phase, and we'll continue this process round after round until either the investigators have won or lost the game. As I described earlier, winning the game and losing the game are not done in the exact same way during each scenario. So although I'll tell you how to win or lose this specific scenario that we're setting up for, please keep in mind that the different scenarios will be different and have different difficulty levels, making them very unique. Now, because the Mythos Phase is skipped on the first round of the game, I'm going to jump right into explaining the investigation phase to you. So let's go into the investigation phase and all of the different actions you can do on your turn. In the investigation phase, the investigators take center stage. During this phase, each investigator takes a separate turn. When it begins, the investigators as a group choose which investigator takes the very first turn. They'll take their entire turn, and then the investigators, again as a group, choose the next investigator to take their turn. The lead investigator does not necessarily have to be the first investigator to take a turn during the investigation phase, but this will continue until each investigator has taken a single turn. On the back of your reference card that shows the round sequence also shows all of the possible actions you can take on your turn, and you can take up to 3 actions during your turn. That's very important as it only starts off with 3. Available actions are listed on this exhaustive list down below, and I'm going to explain what each of them mean. Drawing is the first action, and is the first of the basic actions that we'll talk about. Basic actions are actions that can be taken without activating a card ability or playing a card, and some cards throughout the game will reference basic actions. This isn't necessarily something you have to keep in mind, but it is something that might be checked by other components. When an investigator takes the basic draw action, they take the top card of their deck and add it to their hand. Actions can be taken any number of times and in any order, as long as you have remaining actions available of the 3 that you start with on your turn. So for a strange example, I could draw 3 cards on my turn and then end my turn, or any combination of other actions that we'll talk about. If at any point during the game you go to take a draw action and there's no cards left in your deck, you'll gain 1 horror from the supply and take all of the cards in your discard pile, shuffling them and placing them face down as a new deck. The second action is resource, and it's a basic action which means taking 1 resource from the general supply and adding it to your investigator's supply. This is an incredibly straightforward action that helps you pay for specific cards, but it's not necessarily always the best choice because of different combos that may come up that allow you to gain more resources than just taking this action. The third action is activate, and is not a basic action. An investigator can take the activate action if they have any cards in play under their control, on their location, or on an encounter card at their location, or on the current act or agenda card with this arrow symbol. The arrow symbol means an action trigger, and each one of the different possibilities is something I'll go more in depth on. But basically, you're activating all of this and paying any costs and gaining any benefits of that specific action. The next action is not a basic action, and it is the play action. An investigator using this action selects an asset or event card in their hand, of which you can see which they are in the top left under this number. That number is its resource cost, and it must be paid in the form of resources that you have in order to be played. Pay the resource cost by removing the number of resources from your investigator in order to play the card. For example, I removed 4 resources because I want to play this Isabel's Twin 45s. Asset cards, like the Isabel's Twin 45s, are placed face up in front of you underneath your investigator card. These stay in play under your control until a specific ability or game effect removes them. Now, if it were instead an event card like this one here, the investigator would resolve all of its effects and then immediately place up face up in the discard pile. Each investigator has their own discard pile, and it is not shared with the other investigators or the scenario discard pile. The final type of card are what are called skill cards. Now, you cannot play skill cards by using the play action. Instead, for their abilities and icons to be used, these cards must be committed from an investigator's hand to a skill test. And that's something that we'll be talking about more in depth a little bit later. Only assets and events can be paid for and played from your hand, not skills. The next type of action is the move action, and it's a basic action. An investigator uses this action to move to a connecting location. 2 locations are shown as connected by this connection token between them with the double-sided arrow. You'll then move your investigator's mini card to that new location. A location's connections are indicated by the icons at the bottom of the location card here, each of which match an identical icon in the title area of 1 or more connecting locations. Now, as always, if an investigator moves to an unrevealed location for the first time, that location is immediately revealed. Remember to always place the indicated number of clues on the location when it's revealed. Isabel Barnes was able to move from your friend's room to the dormitories because this icon on the bottom left of your friend's room led to the dormitories icon on the top left of its card. Anytime a location enters play, place one of these connector tokens in between connected locations to remind yourself of this. The next type of action is another basic action, and it's called investigate. An investigator using this action investigates their current location in an attempt to find clues. They do this by performing an intellect test against the shroud value of that location. Intellect is the value next to this book symbol here, shown on the Joe Diamond card, of which is trying to investigate. The Shroud value is this black circle, shown on the left of your friend's room, the location where Joe Diamond is at. If the value was lower, nothing would happen and no clues would be discovered. But because the value on Joe Diamond is higher than the Shroud value on your friend's room, Joe Diamond discovers one clue from that location. Whenever an investigator discovers a clue from a location, they take that clue from the location and places it on their investigator card in their play area. The next action, Engage, is another basic action. An investigator using this action engages one enemy that is at their location. This enemy either cannot be currently engaged with any investigator, or can be currently engaged with another investigator. That means you cannot engage an enemy that you're already engaged with. To engage an enemy, the investigator places that enemy above their card in their play area. The area above your play area is called your threat area, and is particular to you. The Engage action will come in handy when talking about the Evade, Fight, and Parley actions next. And speaking of which, the next type of action is another basic action, the Evade action. An investigator using this action attempts to evade an enemy they're currently engaged with, and involves them performing an agility test against that enemy's evade value. The agility skill is here on the top right-hand corner of the investigator, with a feathered foot icon, and the enemy's evade value is here in green. Now the investigator Joe Diamond's agility is only 2, and the evade value on this Hellhound is 4. Under normal circumstances, the investigator would fail here, and the enemy is not evaded and remains ready and engaged with the investigator. However, in just a minute, we'll talk about how to increase these values during skill tests, so I'm going to teach this as if Joe Diamond did have a higher value than the evade value of this enemy. So as such, for this example, the investigator would succeed, which means that the enemy is exhausted, which means it's turned on its side, and the engagement is broken. Move that enemy card from the investigator's threat area to the investigator's current location, to mark that it's no longer engaged with that investigator. Now, something that we'll talk about in a moment is that exhausted enemies do not automatically engage investigators, don't perform attacks of opportunity, and don't attack during the enemy phase. This is the benefit of having an enemy exhausted, and makes the evade action pretty crucial in certain moments. All of what I just said will come into play in just a moment and will be further explained, so don't worry. Now, this all leads directly into the next action, which is another basic action, Fighting. An investigator using the Fight action attacks one enemy that's at their current location. That investigator performs a combat test against that enemy's fight value. Combat is shown on this third value here with the fist icon, and the enemy's fight value is in the red triangle here. If the investigator succeeds, which again means that their value is higher than the enemy's fight value, that investigator deals a point of damage to the attacked enemy. That damage is placed on the enemy in the form of a damage token. Now, if at any time an enemy has damage on it equal to or greater than its health value, which is this central triangle here that shows 3, that enemy is defeated. You remove all of the damage tokens from it and place its card in the encounter discard pile. Now, throughout the game, some enemies might be defeated that provide the investigators with different amounts of victory points. This is shown here with the Victory X keyword at the bottom of their text box, and for this example, it's Victory 2. Any enemy that has this Victory X keyword is immediately removed from the encounter discard pile and set in the Set Aside area. That card is considered to be in the victory display for the rest of the game. The victory display is not something that you'll necessarily have to know inherently, but other card effects and campaign effects will reference it. Now, if the investigator fails a fight action, no damage is dealt to the attacked enemy. And if that enemy is engaged with another investigator, all damage that would have been dealt to the enemy is dealt to the engaged investigator instead. That's shown in this example, where Joe Diamond attempts to attack the Hellhound that he's in the same room with. However, Isabel Barnes is engaged with it, and he wasn't able to complete the skill test. He ended up hurting his partner instead of hurting the Hellhound. Now, even though there aren't any enemies in the first scenario we'll be playing with the Parlay action on them, I do want to talk about it anyway. It's a play or activate action that represents an investigator's attempt to create a distraction and or talk their way out of a situation, and it's printed directly on the enemies themselves. A Parlay action is next to a bold action designator, and does not trigger any attacks of opportunity when it's used. Each Parlay ability is completely unique and may involve a skill test, like this example here with the combat test. Parlay abilities require an enemy to be present at the performing investigator's location unless explicitly stated otherwise. Now, in the unfortunate event of a player having to leave the game, or the game just becoming a little too impossible to win, you can take the final action called the Resign action. It's a play or activate action and does not trigger attacks of opportunity. When an investigator resigns, take all of their clues and place them at their current location. That investigator and all of their cards, including their mini card that shows their location, are removed from the game completely. However, just as an important note, removing the investigator for any reason, including a resign action, does not change the per investigator value. For example, on your friend's room, it would still be 4. It does not go down to 2, even though there's only one player remaining. Now that we're done with all of the actions, I want to clear something up. You've heard me talk about the term attack of opportunity a couple times. On your reminder card underneath the actions, it explains this. If you're engaged with one or more ready enemies, taking any action other than evade, fight, parlay, or resigning provokes an attack of opportunity and allows the enemies that you're engaged with to immediately attack you. Enemies attacking I'll further explain in the enemy phase, but just know that this is a very dangerous situation to put yourself in. I do also want to talk just a little bit further about skills and skill tests. Each investigator has these 4 skills, which we've already kind of gone over: willpower, intellect, combat, and agility. When you're performing the basic actions that we talked about, fighting, evading, or investigating, the skills being tested are combat, agility, and intellect respectively. However, some card abilities have bolded action designators. Each of these indicates the skill being tested in parentheses after the indicated action type. Each of these actions within themselves explain what happens when you succeed or fail these tests, if anything. When you perform a skill test, you'll also have to reveal chaos tokens from the chaos bag, but first you can modify your skill value to set yourself up better. You can boost this skill value by first committing eligible cards from your hand to the test. An eligible card will bear one or more of the icons matching the skill being tested up here in the top left corner. Some cards even have question marks in this box, which none of my cards in my hand do, but if they did, it would be a wild. The investigator performing the test may then commit any number of cards from their hand to the test, and each other investigator at the same location as that investigator may commit up to 1 card from their hand to help as well. So for an example, Joe Diamond is performing an intellect test on this hand crank flashlight. He has no symbols in his hand that he could help commit to the test, but because he's at the same location as Isabel Barnes, she will commit a single card with 2 wild icons to the test. Additionally, if applicable, players may also include any abilities with this icon during this moment if they apply to a skill test. Isabel Barnes would be able to apply this ability if she was the one performing the test, but because she's not able to in this moment. Now, after committing any cards and making any modifications, the investigator now draws a single token from the chaos bag. If it's a numerical token like this 0 here, it influences the outcome of the skill test, and it's applied to the investigator's skill value for that test. In this example, we're relatively safe because we did not pull a minus to modify our skill down. Instead, we pulled a 0, so it's just as it is. Now, in this moment, if instead you pull an icon instead of a numerical value, refer to the scenario reference card and resolve the corresponding effect for that scenario. Many of these effects will be very negative, as this skull icon is a -X due to X being the current act number. For this scenario, it applies to all skull tokens, cultist tokens, and tablet tokens. However, if the token drawn is an Elder Sign token, refer to your investigator card and resolve your investigator's Elder Sign effect. This is usually a largely powerful, positive effect. However, if you pull the auto-fail token, the test automatically fails regardless of the investigator's skill, modifiers, or test difficulty. If anything checks for this, the investigator's modified skill value is considered to be 0 in this instance. This is the immediately most negative token you can pull from the bag. Finally, upon calculating the investigator's modified skill value, the investigator either succeeds or fails the skill test and resolves any of its effects. Upon completion of the skill test, you'll then discard all of the player cards committed to that test, and return the revealed chaos token to the chaos bag. If any card or cards were committed by another player, they're returned to their respective discard piles. That was a lot of information for the investigation phase, and I hope you've kept up so far. Now I'm going to be moving at more of a breakneck pace through the next 3 phases. We're going to talk about the enemy phase and then the upkeep phase to finish off the round. And then, because we move into the next round, and the second and further rounds start with the Mythos Phase, I'm going to talk about the Mythos Phase last. After we finish up with those 3 phases, I'll talk about some small additional information, and then you'll be ready to play your first game. In the enemy phase, the enemies come for the investigators, and if they're able, they attack. Now, this phase is skipped completely if there's no enemies in play in either the general area or engaged with a specific player in their threat areas. But if there are any enemies in play at all, then we'll perform the enemy phase, starting with Step 1, Enemies Moving. Enemies move only if they have the Hunter or Patrol keywords. In this case, the Hellhound has the Hunter keyword here. Enemies with the Hunter keyword move once to a connecting location in the direction of the nearest investigator. Because this Hellhound is currently at the location with the most amount of investigators, it instead will not move. This being a card game, it heavily relies on different keywords that come up on different cards. Because there's no enemies with the Patrol keyword, as well as many cards that do not exist with the keywords listed in the rulebook, I'm not going to go over every single keyword in detail. Instead, I'll let you find that on your own. But just know for future reference, this would be the moment that enemies with the Patrol keyword would move in the way that they're designated on their card. If an enemy moves and it ends up at a location with investigators, it immediately engages one of those investigators. It's removed and placed in the investigator's threat area as normal. If there were multiple investigators at the location and the enemy does not have the prey keyword, like this Hellhound does not here, then the lead investigator will choose who the enemy engages with. Now, during Step 2, each of the enemies attack. Every ready, engaged enemy makes an attack against the investigator with whom it's engaged. When an enemy attacks, it deals both its damage and its horror simultaneously to the engaged investigator. The amount of damage and horror dealt by an enemy's attack can be found at the bottom of the enemy's text box, as shown here. In this instance, it would be 1 damage and 1 horror. As soon as an enemy attacks during the enemy phase, immediately exhaust it. Note that during other attacks, such as attacks of opportunity we just talked about, enemies do not exhaust themselves. You'll resolve attacks in whichever order that you'd like, and after every enemy has attacked, the enemy phase is over, proceeding to the Upkeep Phase. The Upkeep Phase is a simple series of steps where investigators and enemies regain their bearings and prepare for the next round. Firstly, during this phase, each mini-card that represents investigators are flipped face up if they were face down. Then ready all exhausted cards. That includes enemies, as well as any cards in your play area that exhausted to use them. If an enemy readies and it's not currently engaged, then it immediately engages with one of the players that it's at its location with. Then, each investigator draws a single card from their deck and gains a single resource. And finally, each investigator with more than 8 cards in their hand discards cards of their choice from their hand until they have 8 cards. You can think of 8 as the hand limit at the end of the round. The game round is now over. Proceed to the Mythos Phase at the start of the next game round. The Mythos Phase is where the arcane forces pitted against the investigators seek to advance their fell agenda. Like the Upkeep Phase, the Mythos Phase is also a simple series of steps. You'll first start out by placing 1 Doom counter on the current agenda. Now you'll compare the total number of Doom tokens in play to the Doom threshold on the current agenda. Not just the current agenda will gain Doom tokens. Other effects will also put Doom tokens on other cards in the game, and they can apply to this. If that number in play is currently equal to or greater than the Doom threshold, which is this number here, advance the agenda deck. To advance the deck, remove all of the current Doom tokens, and then flip the agenda over, immediately following any of the instructions on that card. After the instructions are followed in their entirety, you'll remove that agenda from the game, showing the next agenda up on the agenda stack. That next agenda becomes the current agenda in play. After placing Doom and checking the agenda, in player order, each investigator now draws the top card of the encounter deck and resolves its text. Instructions for each one of these encounter cards are going to be explained in just a moment. Enemies and treacheries are the 2 different types of encounter cards. Treachery cards represent hazards, schemes, powers, or deadly encounters with the arcane forces that are set against the investigators. When a treachery card is drawn, note any keywords and then resolve all of its abilities in order. This often requires an investigator to attempt a skill test or make a difficult decision. After a treachery card is resolved, immediately take it and discard it into the encounter discard pile. Enemy cards instead represent monsters, creatures, or humans that are arrayed against the investigators. When an enemy card is drawn, immediately spawn it. Spawning an enemy means placing it at the location of the investigator that just drew the card. It then immediately engages that investigator and is put into its threat area. You're now ready to play a full round in Arkham Horror the card game, starting with the Mythos Phase, Investigation Phase, Enemy Phase, and then Upkeep Phase. This will continue round after round until all the investigators together either win the game or lose the game, which is further explained in the campaign log and on the act and agenda cards. Now, there are just a couple extra tiny details I want to talk about before I leave you to play the rest of your scenario. So let's talk about those, get some important information, and then I'll let you be. Investigator cards, as well as plenty of other cards in the game, have their own unique traits. That's this bold detective right here on Joe Diamond. Because it's a card game, traits do nothing inherently, but a lot of different traits are referenced by different components, so keep an eye out for that. Additionally, the last important thing on the investigator card is their health and their sanity. This determines how much damage or how much horror that this investigator can take before it's defeated. If the number of damage or horror on the card ever equals one of these numbers, then it's immediately defeated, removed from the game just like it had resigned. If all investigators are removed from the game, the investigators immediately lose the game. I also want to talk about act cards, because they're the main way investigators are going to win the game. Each one of these has an objective, which gives you specific instructions, and are different depending on what scenario you're playing. For example, this one says, at the end of the round, investigators may spend the requisite clues, this number here, as a group to advance. Anytime you advance an act, just like you would advance an agenda, you flip it over, perform all of these effects, and then go to the next act. On the backside of the final act often refers you to a specific page within your campaign log. Do not go to this page until you reach this part of this act, and I'll flip it back over because honestly, it's some pretty significant spoilers. It will tell you exactly how the game changes or how you win the game thematically. Again, I'm blocking it with the reference card because of spoilers, but that also says, because it's the first scenario within this campaign, that if you win by completing all the acts, to proceed to scenario 2. And scenario 2 will do the same to proceeding to scenario 3, and so on, depending on the size of your campaign. Many times, if you complete the final scenario's final act, you'll immediately win the game. But that's not always the case, and it'll be different depending on the campaign. Now, we would be here 4 hours if I continued to explain all of the different keywords and effects that could take place within a specific scenario, but instead I'll leave you with 3 pieces of information. The rulebook is your best friend, and I suggest that you keep it open to the glossary, which is the last third of the rulebook, to understand any keywords that you do not immediately understand when they come up in the game. Because this is a card game, card effects might modify the rules that I've talked to you about, or add on top of them, especially with the different keywords on them. If a card effect conflicts with the rules, then the card effect takes priority. The second thing that I'll say is that the campaign guide will tell you all of the differences depending on the campaign. Please keep this open to the campaign that you're currently doing, and any thematics or rules clarifications will be done in there if they apply to your specific scenario and campaign. It also will give you extra information on how to advance onto the next campaign, including modifying your deck depending on how well you did in a scenario. So please, when you're done with a specific scenario, read through that section of the rulebook so you better understand what to do going into the next scenario or the end of the game. And the final piece of information I want to leave you with is that this is a living card game, which means 2 things. You can purchase extra scenarios, investigators, and campaigns to add onto this game, and this core set is meant to be a starting point for you to be able to do that. You can find all of those in the description down below on the Fantasy Flight Games website, or on their distributor that sent me this copy, Asmodee. All of the information on how to include whatever products that you pick up for Arkham Horror the card game will be included in the rulebooks within those products themselves. I also want to say that this box that we learned from is the beginning of Chapter 2, which is sort of a refresh of the game. But any products that you come across, whether that be from Chapter 1 or in the future with Chapter 2 and beyond, will work with this core box, so don't worry about compatibility issues. And also, it being a living card game, that means that there's deck customizations for the different investigators, as well as the different scenarios. But that is the one large chunk of the rulebook that I'll leave you to figure out on your own. There's many games that you can play just out of the pre-built decks from the rulebook. That's those 5 investigators and the 3 scenarios that make up the campaign that you're playing through. But after you're done with that, and if you want to take them apart and rearrange them, the rules for deck customization are in the rulebook itself, so please follow along when you're ready. Now, its nature as a living card game might make this video feel a little bit incomplete, but honestly, most of the fun of this game after a couple of plays comes from learning the deck customization itself. And although it's not required whatsoever, and I'm not necessarily encouraging you to do it, the more products that you pick up and integrate, the more options you'll have for that deck customization as well. Thank you very much for being patient and sticking along with me, because this is the first time that I've taught a living card game like Arkham Horror. So if you feel like you have any comments or criticisms, I would love to hear it in the comments section down below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and thank you to Asmodee for sending this copy of Arkham Horror the card game. If you want to learn another video in the Arkham Horror universe, you can check out Lovecraft Letter on the screen now on the top there, or any other How to Plays on the Cardboard Crash Course down below in the playlist. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.